Canadian population is growing. Sal presented that slide, a very compelling slide, 3% year-over-year growth. That's a very solid number. Enrollment trends in the post-secondary world in Canada are also growing, have been growing for a long time. In this next section, we're going to drill down to those and understand exactly what's going on at the U15 level, at the university level, college level, market more across Canada. So please welcome to moderate very exciting discussion, Scott Johnston from University of Victoria at the Victoria University and the University of Toronto.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm again at Scott Johnston, the Associate Dean at Victoria University and the University of Toronto. So locally, not on the West Coast. I have approximately 17 years experience working in university housing and support and finance as well. So very excited to be on this panel today. I'm going to pass it on to each of the panelists to kind of introduce themselves and talk a little bit about each of the topics and their own experience related to this discussion today. So I'll pass it to Mark Richardson first.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Richardson. I am the CTO at Rich Analytics. Been working in the IT and data space for about 25 years. And in the last 5 years or so, we've been doing a lot of pro bono work around affordable housing in the city of Toronto, and particularly now how that intersects with student housing. If you don't create enough student housing, and we're bringing a lot of students into Toronto, then they begin to cannibalize the units that would be available for other people who are looking for lower cost rental units, particularly near campuses like U of T, like Toronto Metropolitan, like the George Brown campus.
I'll pass it on to Jason now.
All right, good morning. My name is Jason Hunter. I'm the Vice President of Students and Institutional Planning at Humber College. I've been there for about 14 years, and I'm responsible for enrollment planning there, one aspect of my role. And the thing I will say is, I should say I'm feeling a bit of nostalgia because I have spent 8 years at the University of Toronto before I spent the last 14 at Humber College, and I've often said that, well, I didn't go far. In some ways, I couldn't have gone farther. And I think that actually applies to the housing conversation as well when you're looking at the needs of the college students relative to the needs of university students. So I think that's just worth noting. Maybe just a couple of comments I would make, and that's for people's information. Colleges in particular are likely to continue to grow at a pace of about 10 to 15% on average, but there are some colleges within the system projected for fall 2023 that are going to grow up to, one in particular that's going to grow up to 67% year over year. So when you hear that kind of growth, what it tells you, most of that is in the KW region and the GTA, that kind of expresses some of the situation that we find ourselves in with regard to housing. I'm really interested in the next session related to unit type and cost preference, because I can tell you that despite the fact that there's a big housing crunch for Ontario college students and university students, there are also vacancies in some housing on college campuses, and that's directly due to the price point, which for some of our students is starting at about $400 a month. So I think that's really important for people to understand as you look at the market segmentation that's required to try to address those capacity issues.
Jason, do you want to do these slides now?
Oh, sure, yeah. Maybe I'll just make a couple of comments on that. And it's related to domestic and international enrollment, and in particular, in the past 5 years, domestic enrollment in the college sector has decreased by about 20%. I don't think universities have experienced that same loss in domestic, and they've got some levers that can help them to maintain their enrollment within the corridor that we're funded for. International growth in the college sector has grown by 90% over the course of the past 5 years. And I'll just say that we're incented to become. Colleges are funded at 44% of the national average, and universities funded at 57% of the national average for domestic students. So the lever that we have is international enrollment, and just to let you know, I think that's going to continue. But there is a market difference between college and universities. Some of the growth that we have experienced, most of the growth in the college sector has been in relation to students from India. So Humber, as a proportion of our international enrollment, we're about 59% from India. That's low. in the college sector. So when you're looking at the diversification and where people are coming from, that's a big difference, I think, between colleges and universities. That's probably worth noting. You can see the growth here, as I was saying, over the last 5 years. When you look at the split, we're talking about colleges now being on average 50% international.
Morning, everyone. Rudy Bokikio from Stormont Partners. We are a Toronto-based real asset merchant bank. Spend a lot of time on all of the living sectors, multifamily, seniors housing, student housing. By way of background, I spent the first 4 years of my career focusing on US student housing at CPP. When I moved back to Toronto, I intended to spend an equal amount of time on the Canadian student housing sector. I'd say it's been a slow burn, but from a capital markets perspective, I've probably heard more about Canadian student housing in the last 12 months than the 9 years that preceded it. So obviously enrollment trends are a driving force behind the investment theses that institutional and private investors have as they look to allocate capital to the space. So I'm looking forward to digging into some of those trends. But with that, I'll just hand it off to the rest of the guys that can get going on the panel topics.
Perfect. Realizing that we still have a big trend in terms of students migrating to city centers, how are colleges and universities collaborating with cities and provinces to manage and support this growth? Can I pass that to you, Mark?
Sure. Can we start with the phrase "not very well"? So I think Brian and I actually started our conversation about 15, 16 months ago. Toronto Metropolitan University, they have a big parking lot at Jarvis and Dundas. They had proposed a 14-story building for administrative and classrooms, and then they're going to put a tower above it. That tower is going to have about 500 beds in it, which is almost half of what they currently have. I think TMU only has 12 or 1,300 beds right now. So that project got canceled. So they're still building the administrative and the classroom building. They're not building the tower above it. It would have had the 500 plus student beds. And part of that is because there's no way for them to get support to fund that building from the province, from CMHC. CMHC does not consider student housing a type of housing that they will support at the federal level. Municipally, the city was all in on giving them the height and the density that they needed to create that. We are clearly dependent on international students to come in and keep our post-secondary programs alive and thriving and growing in Canada. We're using it as a de facto immigration system. We have a duty of care as Canadians, and we have a social responsibility that goes beyond the borders of our colleges or our universities. We have to, at the federal, at provincial level, be putting money into on-campus student housing, whether that's delivered directly by the university or by the university with, third-party partners. Like any other affordable housing, we need to be able to borrow money at 3% for 30 years to make some of these programs work at the kind of dollar value that these international students are able to pay for accommodation when they arrive. If they don't get those units, they end up in, a basement apartment in Scarborough, which has probably illegal, has fire risks. There are a lot of bad outcomes. Students going to food banks, all kinds of stuff, and that's directly because we're treating them as a resource to extract from, to keep our post-secondary organizations alive, rather than a community to invest in as the next generation of new Canadians.
And I can maybe just underline that a little bit with a specific Humber example, and that's we have a 325 bed residence coming online as of fall 2024, which is good news in this, to the extent that we can tell that story as everyone is thinking about how they're building. But I can tell you that if we were to build that residence over again, starting now, I don't think we'd be building the same building. Before we've even had any students in that space, we're already looking at doubling some of the rooms because it's just a different residence we need to build for the price point that our students can afford now, and the scale that we need to be building on. So, I think that's the case. We realize that we're funding all of that with our own capital. If we were to do any more, when we do more, it will be because we've found some source of funding, some partners that can work with us in the context that we're in. But our ability to fund that kind of build going forward is very challenging.
And I'd also add, I think one of the challenges is, Toronto has always been a very expensive city to live in on a relative basis. But when you look at the trends and you see the surges in international enrollment in other parts of the country where it has been cheaper to live, relatively speaking, it proves more problematic because those smaller cities are unable to keep up with that surge in demand, and we are now having local populations having to deal with drastic movements in housing prices and rental price point. And so figuring out how we can bring supply to the Guelphs and the Windsors and the Kingstons of the world is also quite important, because a lot of this growth is ending up in places that are probably even less equipped to deal with it than Toronto.
Yeah, Thunder Bay, North Bay, some of the universities and colleges that are in parts of that weren't always as attractive to an international student. Now there's certainly places where people are going to, and the housing outcomes in a place like Thunder Bay or North Bay are way more challenging than they are in Toronto, where at least we do have thousands of basement apartments in Scarborough that people might be able to get into. There's just not even that capacity there.
And in those markets, I'd say Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, these cities have had a lot of success in attracting capital. The Thunder Bays of the world, less so, but that's going to need to change it. Things are going to get fixed.
Yeah, and I think people understand this, but across the college sector, when you see growth happening as part of all 24 colleges, most of that's happening in the GTA through partnerships that are here in the city of Toronto or within the GTA. So that's where a lot of that pressure is. There isn't as much pressure in those local communities as there is with the GTA. The other thing I wanted to say, because I know Guelph was referenced earlier, just again to highlight the difference between colleges and universities, the pressure on Guelph, from my perspective, is not because of growth at the University of Guelph and their enrollment. This is really related to growth from colleges in the KW region coming into Guelph. So that's the impact that colleges are having in terms of this change in this, the housing capacity issue.
Yeah, it's kind of a variation of the drive until you qualify example. You're starting to find that people are bleeding from the Kitchener-Waterloo region into the Guelph area, into places like Fergus, right, where Fergus has never thought that they would have a student housing challenge.
Perfect. So thinking about that, the demand for student housing, of course, leads to increased rental costs for the broader community. What concerns exist for any of you in terms of the potential for a populist government to kind of come in and limit student visas or kind of slow down the flow of international students? I know the Trudeau government was flagging that in August.
Yeah, I can say that that's a major concern. One of the things that people might be aware of, and I know this is a sort of in-depth analysis, so I can share this. But there's been a blue ribbon panel in Ontario that has just been released. The outcome of that has been released for the government to try to do something. We'll see what the government is willing to do in relation to funding colleges and universities in the province. But I'm not overly hopeful that that's going to make a big difference in terms of that funding that we need to continue to operate. International enrollment is going to continue to be really important, but I think that some of the pressures that are happening, whether it's locally, from a municipality perspective, provincially, nationally, are going to have some impact to really start to ratchet down some of the ability for colleges to use international enrollment growth as a lever that it hasn't been in the past 5 years.
So I can speak to the populism issue. Yes, it's going to happen. Of course, it's going to happen. We're in a time of decreasing capacity in journalism. We're seeing it everywhere, and that has a direct impact on the ability for anybody to create their own journalism-like content, be they a politician, be they a pressure group, be they whatever. And it is changing the tone. And the new thing and the new people are always the easy scapegoat. And it changes, like over the last few years, we've had there was an issue with the Saudi government where they pulled a bunch of medical student visas. There's some discussion that maybe the Indian student visas will decrease if things aren't going well with China. Maybe the Chinese inbound student visas decrease. There's populism, and it's not just in Canada. There's populism everywhere. And as an industry or as a sector, the colleges and the universities have become very dependent upon a stable supply chain of new 18 and 19-year-olds who are willing to move to this country and pay 3 and 4 times the going rate. So that is something that will be disrupted some point. COVID disrupted it, changed the price of rental units. There's going to be disruption, there's going to be populism, and it's like, comes like the duty of care idea that we have to generate capacity at a speed and a scale in student housing that we probably haven't done since the 1960s.
Yeah, and just to make the point around the dependence on international enrollment, I am positive that every college and university in the province would be running a structural deficit if it didn't depend on, or if it could not depend on international enrollment. And if there's not that commitment to funding, then there is a bit of a reckoning, because if international enrollment gets ratcheted down and there's not a willingness to fund, we're in a tough spot.
Yeah, and I would just say that any sort of volatility in that respect is obviously going to prove problematic for attracting capital. And ultimately, you've touched on that a bunch of times already, that's sort of the ultimate solution to solving broader housing crisis, let alone the student housing crisis.
In looking at the student population in the next 10 years, so 2020 to 2030, Stats Canada, rough numbers, they're expecting a 20% increase in domestic student populations to universities. Is there any plan in terms of the portfolios that you're working in terms of absorbing that growth, as well as the international numbers as well? Is there the capacity to do that?
There's capacity, but the issue, will continue to be, as this Blue Panel report has been released, one of the things that's been recommended is that there's a consideration for the northern colleges in particular to see the lower part of their funding corridor get lowered, but that I don't think is going to happen within Southern Ontario, within the GTA. And if that's the case, it's going to cause people to compete, but we're competing in a context of 44% funding that really doesn't make it highly feasible to enroll more domestic students. We will, but that's a difficult proposition for us. So while we might get that demographic bump, it has to be funded in a way that makes us sustainable. It's going to do nothing to support institutional sustainability.
If you're losing money on every student who's a domestic student, you don't make it up in volume.
And I'd say, while there is probably capacity or the ability to grow said capacity, replacement cost or the cost of constructing unit housing is ever growing. So that the cost of said housing is not necessarily going to be at a price point that is supportive of domestic students looking to get a good education at an attractive price point, or an international student, frankly, who's looking to do the same.
We're really providing uplifting information.
This is the feel-good session.
Are there any questions from the audience? Throwing it back to the panel, realizing that there's been such a bump in terms of international student growth, how are your organizations increasing staffing to support these international students, and are you keeping pace with that?
Yeah, I guess I can generally say, there is revenue to support the increase in staffing to support international students. And there's some investment to be made there. So I'm not sure if that's the whole question, Scott. One of the ways that we're continuing to be able to support the operations academic delivery is to provide more online courses. That's happening probably more so in the college sector than it is in the university sector. But that has an impact on housing need as well. So if most of your domestic students are living at home and they're local, or if people are, able to live further from the GTA, for instance, because they can take their courses online, that's a bit of a nuance, but there's a level of analysis that needs to take that into consideration as well, because just because students are enrolled in a college in the GTA doesn't mean they're living in the GTA.
I'm going to hand this one back to you, Scott.
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, and I have seen in terms of the university realm, certainly an increase in terms of the amount of support, especially there's simple problems that are easy for domestic students, but complicated for international students, thinking about health access, even thinking about kind of what the grocery stores look like and how to kind of access basic services in Canada. So I think that's certainly been growing at U of T in terms of resources as well. Thinking about recruitment and kind of showcasing spaces to students, how are you able to do that? Realizing a lot of the students aren't coming to campus before their arrival. You're not connecting to the residences before. How are you engaging those international students in advance of their arrival?
Yeah, that's a good question, Scott. And one of the ways that, again, I can't really speak to what's happening in the university sector over the course of the past 10 or 12 years, but certainly from a college perspective, we depend on agents to support international enrollment, and we depend on their honesty with people as they're coming. We depend on having that relationship and maintaining our reputation. So, and you're right, students come, they don't necessarily have a plan for where they're going to live until they arrive. In some cases, they may have a short-term opportunity, but we are navigating. That's the reality, is that for us, again, many of our students are on an immigration path. That's not necessarily their primary reason to be here. They're here to get an education. They're here to establish themselves, get a career, but they are on an immigration path as well. So, when the opportunity comes, they're coming, and some of those issues get resolved once they get here.
Any thoughts in terms of supporting these students post-graduation in terms of housing? Mark, have there been any thoughts in terms of your realm?
I mean, certainly we come from outside of the traditional just student housing space. We come from the workforce housing space in a lot of cases. We did a number of reports, 2019, 2020, 21, with Toronto Region Board of Trade, their housing for workers and housing for essential workers. So you may have somebody who's coming over from India or the Philippines and is being trained at a college or university as a nurse or as a personal support worker. When they get into the employment realm, they need to be able to have a place to live as well at the kinds of incomes that we know that nurses earn. There's hospital after hospital, a few blocks away from here, and a first-year nurse can't afford to live anywhere near that hospital. So we have to have a full spectrum of housing supports that make it possible for people to transition from arriving in Toronto, going through the education system, and then remaining and thriving in Toronto to start their lives here.
Yeah, I'll just add too. I mean, one of the things that we're doing a lot, and we're funded in part through performance outcomes, for all students, for international students as they graduate. We recognize that coming into the market, there's a market component to who's being hired into the jobs, and so we're investing more in helping students, particularly international students, to transition into employment, both through engagement with the community and trying to find supportive people who will do that hiring, but also in preparing people for the workforce. And I think that we see some of that with our international students coming into employment centers, looking for support in achieving employment. And obviously that employment is critical to being able to afford housing.
Well, I think to the George Brown example from yesterday or the report earlier this week, it's actually also affecting your ability to hire people to work in your colleges and work in your universities.
Yeah, and I guess I would say solving for housing after student housing is really important in that. These institutions are meant to drive growth for these cities over time. And if you can't retain that talent, your city is going to suffer over the long term. And so while we're all here today talking about student housing, figuring out how we house people after the fact is also quite important.
I think we're at time right now. I want to thank our panel today and our audience as well. So a lot of important points brought up today.
All right, thank you to the panel. Rudy Fogicchio, Real Estate Investment Advisor, Stormont, Jason Hunter, VP Students in Institutional Planning at Humber College. Jason, we appreciate your slides. And Mark Richardson, Chief Technology Officer, Rich Analytics, and Scott Johnston from the U of T. We will move into our next session, evolution of product type and cost tolerances. We'll start momentarily.
Yeah, I guess so.